What is President Trump's grand strategy for the Middle East? Have a look at this clip from his speech in Saudi Arabia just the other day.
I want to make a deal with Iran. If I can make a deal with Iran, I'll be very happy if we're going to make your region and the world a safer place. But if Iran's leadership rejects this olive branch and continues to attack their neighbors, then we will have no choice but to inflict massive maximum pressure, drive Iranian oil exports to zero like I did before. If you know that, they were a virtually bankrupt country because of what I did. They had no money for terror. They had no money for Hamas or Hezbollah, and take all action required to stop the regime from ever having a nuclear weapon. Iran will never have a nuclear weapon.
So the key to understanding President Trump's strategy for the Middle East is to understand the relationship with Saudi Arabia. Let me point out that in 2017, the very first trip that President Trump took abroad as President of the United States was to Saudi Arabia. President Trump gave a keynote address during that time at the Arab Islamic American Summit. And in that speech, he called for Muslim leaders to drive out terrorism from their countries, and he condemned Hamas and the Iranian government for their support of the government of Bashar al-Assad and for their support of terrorism in the region. It's important to note that during this time period, both before it and for a few years after it, the Iranian-backed Houthis, who have been in the news a lot lately, were at war with Saudi Arabia. They were actually attacking Saudi Arabia on a regular basis, a little bit off the radar for most people following Western news. But from 2016 to 2021 or 22, I think it was, the Houthis were regularly launching ballistic missile attacks at the Saudis and all kinds of other military attacks. They killed Saudi civilians. They caused billions of dollars of damage to Saudi oil assets. The Saudis viewed the Houthis, and by extension the Iranians, as an actual enemy throughout this period. On June 5th of 2017, just a couple of months after Trump made his historic visit to Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Yemen, Egypt, and Bahrain all announced that they were cutting off diplomatic relations with Qatar. They were called their embassies, and they just completely cut off diplomatic relations. They cut off all travel to Qatar. They were trying to isolate Qatar, and they did this because Qatar is a supporter of global jihad, a supporter of terrorism. It was Qatar who was bankrolling Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Hamas, and they understood that Qatar is their enemy. Even though Qatar was at the Arab Summit when Trump spoke, it was their support of international terrorism that led these countries to all cut them off. And there was even almost a war in the Persian Gulf around that time. These nations really wanted to take down the Qataris. Now, during Trump's administration, he, of course, destroyed ISIS. He sanctioned the Iranian regime, severe sanctions, cutting off their ability to sell their oil to anyone. Anyone who would purchase Iranian oil would not be able to do business in the United States. This meant that the Iranian regime was almost bankrupt. Nobody was buying their oil. I think North Korea was the only country buying it. This meant that the Iranian regime, besides being on the verge of collapse, which would have been a great blessing to their people who hate the regime and are praying for the day that it collapses, they had no money to fund Hamas, to fund Hezbollah, to fund the Houthis. And lo and behold, terrorism was at an all-time low. In Israel, during the years of the Trump administration, were the lowest terrorist casualty numbers from any year in Israel's history, from 1948 till today. The fewest terrorist casualties year over year were 2018, 2019, and 2020. Those were the three lowest years in terrorist casualties in Israel's history. A lot of that had to do with the fact that there was a disincentive for terrorism, and it wasn't only cutting off Iran's funding so they couldn't fund Hamas and Hezbollah, but Trump also cut off funding to the Palestinian Authority so long as they would continue to support the families of terrorist murderers. They refused to stop supporting them. The Trump administration cut off their funding as well. Of course, the Trump administration also took care of killing Qasem Soleimani, who was the top commander in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is the military arm of the jihadist terrorist regime in Iran. And then Trump moved the U.S. Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, and that was such a significant event. I've talked about it in some earlier videos, but the reason it was so significant is that for many, many years before the embassy was moved, is that we were always told that if the United States recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, if the United States moved their embassy to Israel, there would be war across the Middle East, the Muslim states would never stand for it, it would cause a major diplomatic crisis. Lo and behold, nothing happened. I call it the greatest dog that didn't bark story in the history of international diplomacy, that nothing happened when the embassy was moved. There was no war, there was no unrest. In fact, imagine had you told someone before Trump moved the embassy and recognized Jerusalem as the capital, that if the U.S. moves its embassy, not only will it not cause war, but it will actually lead to greater peace treaties between Israel and other Muslim states. People would have thought you were crazy if you had said that to them, but that's exactly what happened. The Abraham Accords, ushering in a new era in the Middle East where Muslim states are making peace with Israel and starting to do business with them and normalizing relations, happened after the embassy was moved. This is all part of one grand strategy. Let me just sum up what we said so far. Come down on the bad guys, sanction Iran, cut off the funding to the terrorists, and at the same time reward those who want to peacefully engage in greater business deals with them, and forge peace alliances with the moderates who want engagement with the West and not the destruction of the West. You might have seen in the news a couple days ago that there was a big armaments deal that was signed between the United States and the Saudis to the tune of $600 million. Well, back in 2017, they made a similar deal. That one was valued at $350 million. So you see how this works. Trump incentivizes those nations that want to peacefully engage with the West, and at the same time, he comes down hard on those who want to export terrorism and jihad. And this leads to peace and stability. It's what we call peace through strength, which is not just about having a heavy hand against the bad guys. It's also about strengthening the good guys and empowering them, and that leads to peace. So that's what happened. The Biden administration comes in 2021, they immediately lift the sanctions on Iran, and that allows money for their terrorist proxies. The Chinese immediately start buying Iranian oil to the tune of, at this point, over $100 billion in oil sales since the Biden administration came in and lifted those sanctions. The Biden administration stated their intention to re-engage with Iran in negotiations. Now, I'll also add in that during Biden's presidential campaign in 2020, he criticized Saudi Arabia and said that he would turn them into a pariah state. And in 2022, as President Biden declared that Qatar was a major non-NATO strategic ally of the United States. So if you put all of those moves together, what Biden was signaling to the Saudis, he was signaling to them that the U.S. cannot be trusted. So what happened? The results of this we saw when during his presidency, Joe Biden visited Saudi Arabia. He was trying to get the Saudis to lower oil prices. The Saudis did not cooperate with him. It was a disaster of a visit. Basically pushed the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates into the arms of the Chinese Communist Party. They started building closer and closer relationships with the CCP, who was, of course, America's sworn mortal enemy and the only real existential threat to the United States. During the Biden administration, the Chinese Communist Party signed a 25-year strategic partnership with Iran. It's not just about buying their oil, but also a partnership with them that involves military and defense partnership. 90% of Iranian oil sales since that time have been sales to the Chinese Communist Party. And the Iranians now had the money to fund Hamas, to fund Hezbollah, to fund the Houthis. The Saudis, the Emiratis, those moderate Sunni states were moving away from the United States. So ultimately what we see is that the Saudis were moving closer to the CCP. This culminated towards the end of 2022, where the Saudis wanted to get the Houthis to stop attacking them. They were losing billions of dollars in oil revenues because of damage to their infrastructure from attacks from the Iranian-backed Houthis. So the Chinese stepped in and brokered a rapprochement between Iran and the Saudis, and this stopped the Houthi attacks on Saudi Arabia. The UAE, the United Arab Emirates, also joined BRICS. BRICS is the coalition of nations that was started principally by the Russians and the Chinese Communist Party to start doing business without using the US dollar as the prime reserve currency. The goal of BRICS long term is to have an alternative to the US dollar and ultimately to bring down the US dollar as the prime reserve currency. And the UAE, who had been for so long such a friend of the US, but they saw how the US was treating them under Biden, so they joined up with BRICS. The Saudis were invited to join BRICS and have stated their intention to do so and continue to go to BRICS meetings. Even just 2 weeks ago, at the end of April, the Saudis attended the BRICS summit in Brazil, but they are not a member. But the only reason that the UAE and the Saudis are even part of this whole BRICS thing is because of the way they were treated by the Americans, and they were pushed away from an alliance with the U.S. by the Biden administration. So that was the state of affairs when Trump took office for his second term. Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis were at war with Israel. The Chinese Communist Party and Russia and Iran had an alliance that was growing stronger and stronger. The Iranians have very advanced drone technology and drone industry, and they're producing a lot of the drones that the Russians have used in their war against Ukraine. Very strong alliance built between these three nations, the Chinese Communist Party, the Russians, and the Iranians. And at the same time, we have the Iranians advancing towards a nuclear weapon. So that is what Donald Trump's trip is all about. What Donald Trump is accomplishing on this trip is he is pulling the Saudis and the Emiratis, the Gulf states, he's pulling them back into the American orbit. He's trying to isolate Iran by putting strong sanctions on them. The Trump administration has reinstated sanctions on Iran, and they've been ramping them up. They didn't do them all at once. Even just a couple days ago, just on the eve of Trump's trip, they added more sanctions to the Iranians. They're trying to pressure the Iranians. And ultimately, as Trump said, he's willing, if the Iranians don't back off and dismantle their nuclear program, he will bring their oil exports, as he said in that clip, to zero. And this will reinstate what he did in his first term. So simultaneously with the heavy hand against the Iranians and against the Houthis, at the same time, building more cordial relations with the moderate Arab states. That's what he's doing on this trip. Now, one more point I want to add in here. You might have seen in the headlines coming out of Trump's trip that he announced that he's lifting the sanctions on Syria. These are old sanctions that go back to the Assad regime that the U.S. has always had against Syria. Obviously, the Assad regime was a rogue state. And a lot of people are scratching their heads. Why is Trump lifting the sanctions on Syria? The new leader of Syria, this guy Mohammed Al-Shara, otherwise known as Al-Julani. But I actually think it's a brilliant move. I think it's a great move that he's doing. Question for this new Syrian leader is, which part of the Muslim world is he going to align himself with? Is he going to align himself with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the backer of Hamas, which is backed by Qatar and backed by Turkey, who have been speaking in very hostile tones and are really aligned with the terrorist infrastructure around the world? Is Al-Shara going to align himself more closely with Iran? The Iranians lost an important asset with the fall of the Assad regime because they had a straight line from Iran across into Lebanon to transport weapons and to transport people and all kinds of resources. They gained a lot from having a foothold in Syria, and they lost that, and they're trying to get it back. So the question for Al-Julani, for Mohammed Al-Shara, the leader of Syria, is, whose camp is he going to be in? Is he going to be in the camp of the Saudis, of the Emiratis, of the moderate Arab states who are engaging positively with the West and are even moving towards diplomatic relations with Israel? In the example of Saudi Arabia, they haven't joined the Abraham Accords, but they certainly have warmer relations with Israel. Of course, the UAE, Bahrain, others actually have diplomatic relations with Israel. And you might have seen that Trump invited Al-Shara, the leader of Syria, to join the Abraham Accords, which seems laughable because, look, this guy's an Al-Qaeda guy. Is he really going to join a peace treaty with Israel? No, I don't know if he will or he won't. But the lifting of the sanctions was absolutely the right move, because now putting the sanctions back, it can be used as a measure that he can reinstate if Al-Julani does not behave. What he's being signaled is that there's a lot of benefit to behaving. So he removes the sanctions and then says, okay, go ahead. Let's see if you can behave yourself. Let's see if you're going to be part of the peaceful nations that want to engage peacefully with the West and with Israel. And if he plays ball, great. The sanctions remain off, and he's pulled into the orbit of the Americans and the Saudis and the Emiratis. But if he turns into a rogue state, if the sanctions were on, if he was being treated right now as a rogue state, he'd have no reason not to enter into the orbit of the other rogue actors in the region. Hovering over this whole conversation, and I've mentioned it numerous times and in my last video, is the problem of Qatar. You see, Qatar is viewed by so many people in the West as another one of these moderate Western Muslim states. People think of them in the same category as the Saudis, as the Emiratis, but they're really not. As I said before, in 2017, the other moderate Arab states actually cut off diplomatic relations from Qatar because of their support for Hamas, because of their support for terrorism all over the region, because of their funding of all the bad activity of the Muslim Brotherhood across the world. What did the Qataris do? They hosted the World Cup. They founded Al Jazeera to start spreading Western-style news around the world with the slant of their ideology. They house the Muslim Brotherhood leadership. The clerical leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood is based in Qatar to this day. Hamas's leadership, living luxurious lives in Qatar for many, many years. The Qataris are the source of a lot of the anti-Western and anti-Israel and anti-Semitic messaging that's going on American college campuses. They fund American campuses to the tunes of hundreds of millions of dollars every year. So the Qataris remain a very problematic actor here, and yet the United States has their largest base in the region in Qatar, and we know that many of the people in the Trump administration have close relationships with people in the Qatari leadership. So Qatar's role in all of this is something to keep our eye on. It's something very worrisome about this, but overall, the strategy of President Trump in his Middle East trip is actually not about the Middle East. It's really about the Chinese Communist Party. The number one enemy of the U.S. is the Chinese Communist Party. And what Donald Trump seeks to accomplish on this trip, and I think he's accomplishing it, is reassuring those moderate Arab states of the relationship with the U.S., building stronger economic relationships with them, which keep them tied to the U.S. in a more cooperative way and keep them away from the influence of the Chinese Communist Party, and by proxy, keeping them away from a relationship with Iran. And at the same time, putting that maximum pressure on Iran to bring them to heel and ultimately to reinstate the peace through strength approach, which will bring peace and prosperity to the region. So that's my take on what Trump's grand strategy for the Middle East is and what he's doing on this trip. I would love to hear what you think about my thoughts here. Please drop a comment below. And if you like this video, share it with other people. Let other people know about this channel. But I really do want to hear what you have to say. Please drop a comment below and we'll talk about it in the next video.